If you were to walk into a room full of people with exceptionally high IQs, you probably wouldn't recognize a single one of them. They aren't the ones aggressively winning arguments or commanding the center of attention. In fact, to the untrained eye, their most common psychological traits look like anything but intelligence. They look like chronic laziness, social detachment, or severe overthinking. The truth is, a highly advanced brain doesn't just make a person smarter. It forces them to navigate existence with a completely different internal operating system. It alters the resolution through which they experience existence. And that massive baseline difference shows up in ways that society profoundly misreads. Think about the last time you saw someone who just seemed to slip away from a crowd, preferring their own company over the collective buzz of a room. To the outside world, this can easily be misread as antisocial behavior, social awkwardness, or a dislike of others. But neurologically, it has nothing to do with hating people. Highly intelligent individuals often spend significant amounts of time alone, simply because of how their brains process information. The prefrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain responsible for complex reasoning, long-term planning, and deep reflection, tends to function most effectively in quiet environments devoid of external distraction. For a high IQ brain, solitude isn't a state of loneliness. It is literal fuel. A landmark study published by the London School of Economics uncovered something that seems entirely counterintuitive at first glance. The researchers found that while average individuals report higher life satisfaction when they socialize more frequently, highly intelligent individuals reported significantly lower life satisfaction from frequent social interaction. Their brains quite literally do not recharge the way most people's do. Social interaction, while engaging, is incredibly cognitively expensive for a brain that is biologically incapable of turning off its analytical filters. When you are subconsciously analyzing every layer of what is happening in a room, reading micro-expressions, parsing vocal tones, and mapping social dynamics, a simple casual conversation can feel like running a cognitive marathon. And this exhaustion is compounded by another frustrating reality, which is that their thinking simply never stops. It doesn't stop during rest. It doesn't stop late at night when they are trying to sleep, and it doesn't stop during activities that most people find naturally relaxing. There is always a background process running. The mind is perpetually turning over a problem, revisiting a conversation from 3 days ago, building a new theory, or running complex mental simulations for things that haven't even happened yet. The Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski studied this extensively in gifted individuals and described it through his landmark framework as psychomotor overexcitability. He found that highly intelligent people experience a restless internal energy, a drive to think that lacks a natural off switch. Modern neuroimaging backs this up perfectly. Higher intelligence isn't just about faster processing in isolated, localized areas of the brain. Instead, it is strongly associated with richer, denser connectivity between distant, disparate regions of the brain. The highly intelligent brain makes vast connections across a massive network of ideas simultaneously all the time. That constant, hyper-connected neurological firing is exactly what makes mental rest so difficult to achieve. But this hyperconnectivity doesn't just apply to abstract logic. It applies to emotions as well, which directly contradicts the classic cultural archetype of the robotic genius. There is a widespread assumption that high intelligence comes hand in hand with emotional detachment, the cold, hyper-rational thinker who lives entirely in the mind and feels nothing. Yet psychology research directly contradicts this picture. People with significantly elevated IQs actually tend to feel things with a far greater intensity than average, not less. Going back to Dabrowski's framework, this is known as emotional overexcitability, a heightened baseline responsiveness to emotional stimuli. This neurological sensitivity makes high IQ individuals acutely responsive to art, music, beauty, structural injustice, and the suffering of others. A study published in the journal Intelligence confirmed this correlation, showing that higher measured IQ systematically correlates with greater emotional reactivity and depth. The reason this trait remains largely invisible to the outside world is that highly intelligent people also tend to have highly developed cognitive regulation strategies. Because their emotions are so intense, they learn early in life to internalize them, processing them through a logical lens before showing them to the world. They look calm, cool, and detached on the surface, but underneath they are drowning in emotional data. This constant inner processing creates a profound sense of intellectual humility, which manifests as a complete comfort with saying 3 simple words: I don't know. This trait confuses people because we naturally assume that extreme intelligence should produce extreme confidence. We expect a genius to have an answer for everything. Yet, psychology consistently shows the exact opposite pattern. People with very high IQs are far more likely to openly acknowledge the strict limits of their own knowledge than people with average intelligence. And they do it genuinely, not as a calculated social performance. This connects directly to the high end of the Dunning-Kruger effect. In that well-documented psychological phenomenon, we learn that lower cognitive ability often produces unshakable overconfidence because a person lacks the metadata required to see how much they don't know. They don't know enough to see the immense complexity that exists within a domain. Highly intelligent people, by contrast, understand complexity intimately. They have thought deeply enough and encountered enough exceptions to rules to see just how much of reality remains genuinely uncertain. Therefore, when a high IQ person admits they don't know something, it isn't a sign of hesitation or weakness. It is a sign of precision. However, this deep understanding of complexity comes with a heavy price that highly intelligent people rarely ever talk about openly, because it is incredibly easy for others to misinterpret as arrogance. In psychological literature, it is recognized as a near universal experience among the gifted, and it is known as the problem of stimulus poverty, coined by the pioneering psychologist Leta Hollingworth, who dedicated decades of her life to studying highly gifted individuals. It describes the painful experience of a mind that cannot find sufficient challenge, resonance, or depth in its immediate social environment. When a high IQ individual engages in casual conversation, they aren't trying to be difficult or elitist, but conversations that remain strictly on the surface level, or social environments that show no interest in deeper existential questions, leave them feeling a very specific, hollow kind of unstimulated. What Hollingworth observed in these individuals wasn't arrogance at all. It was a quiet, profound longing for real conversation. It was a search for someone who could follow them all the way to the absolute bottom of an idea without needing to turn back or get uncomfortable. Because they rarely find this, highly intelligent people often learn to hold back. They deliberately calibrate themselves down to fit into the room, meaning that a massive portion of who they actually are never enters the conversation at all. This brings us to their remarkable cognitive flexibility, which is the neurological capacity to treat beliefs as working theories, rather than fixed identities. For the average brain, a deeply held belief often becomes intertwined with the ego. When new information arises that contradicts that belief, the brain perceives it as a literal threat to the self, triggering cognitive dissonance and defensiveness. The brain of a highly intelligent person operates differently. When new verifiable information appears, even data that directly and aggressively contradicts what they previously believed, their brain seamlessly updates its internal model of reality. They don't experience changing their mind as an embarrassing defeat or a threat to who they are. They experience it as a necessary correction in the pursuit of accuracy. In cognitive psychology, this flexibility is considered one of the highest markers of advanced problem-solving ability. The high IQ mind isn't attached to being right. It is obsessively interested in having the most accurate possible picture of reality. From the outside, this can occasionally look like inconsistency or flip-flopping. Unenlightened observers might view a shifting position as a sign of unreliability, but what they are actually witnessing is a continuous, radically honest update process. Because they value this update process so highly, they naturally develop a distinct preference for observation over immediate expression. In group settings, social gatherings, or professional meetings, highly intelligent people almost always default to watching and listening before they ever speak. They are not necessarily shy, nor do they lack social skills. Instead, they are data gathering, while others are rushing to voice their opinions to secure status in the room. The high IQ mind is silently listening to what isn't being said, as much as to what is. They are effortlessly picking up on the invisible patterns of social dynamics, who defers to whom, where the underlying tension lies, what the hidden agendas are, and what the conversation is actually about, beneath the superficial surface text. Research into the intersection of social intelligence and general cognitive ability consistently shows that a higher IQ correlates beautifully with an accurate reading of social cues and emotional signals. But because they are taking in so much more raw data than the average person, they require more time to process it all before they formulate a response. They aren't slower thinkers. They are just building a much larger, more complete picture of the room before they open their mouth. Yet, this massive conceptual picture can sometimes paralyze them, leading to one of the most frustrating and deeply confusing aspects of the high IQ experience. It is the tendency to procrastinate the hardest on the work that actually matters to them the most. When a highly intelligent person procrastinates on a meaningful project, the world labels them as lazy, undisciplined, or unmotivated. But researchers studying high cognitive ability have found that this specific type of paralysis isn't laziness at all. It is a psychological phenomenon known as complexity awareness. Before an average person begins a task, they see a relatively straight line from start to finish. But before a high IQ brain even picks up a pen, it instantly comprehends the full, terrifying scope of what true excellence would require. The mind automatically runs a simulation of every potential flaw. The finished product might contain every single way it could fall short of the ideal standard, and every conceptual hurdle they will have to cross. This ties closely into psychologist Carol Dweck's extensive research. On gifted individuals, she identified a persistent fear, not necessarily a fear of failure in the traditional sense, but a fear of the painful gap between their flawless internal vision and the inevitable imperfections of their external output. The procrastination isn't a sign that they don't care about the work. It is the paralyzing presence of caring far too much. This baseline of high expectations creates a notoriously low tolerance for repetition, leaving them with a mind that gets bored faster than almost anyone around them. Highly intelligent people tank or habituate to stimuli incredibly quickly. In psychological terms, this means their brains grasp the underlying pattern of a routine, a task, or a concept long before others do. And once that pattern is mastered, the cognitive reward system shuts off. They require a constant stream of novel, complex input just to maintain the exact same baseline level of mental engagement that most people derive from comfortable, familiar routines. At a neurological level, neuroscientific research has linked higher cognitive ability to a significantly higher baseline of dopamine activity within the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter fundamentally responsible for our brain's reward and pursuit systems, especially regarding information seeking and intellectual curiosity. When a high IQ individual is denied intellectual challenge, their internal dopamine signal drops sharply, causing a state of profound restlessness. This restlessness isn't just a fleeting bad mood. It is a physiological response to cognitive starvation. This is precisely why you will see highly intelligent people hyper-focusing on multiple entirely unrelated interests simultaneously, changing their career paths drastically throughout their lives, or feeling intensely dissatisfied in life situations that appear perfectly stable and comfortable from the outside. Ultimately, this all leads to a deeply entrenched, persistent state of self-doubt and internal uncertainty. To the outside observer, this makes no logical sense. We look at a brilliant person and wonder how someone so capable can be so completely unsure of themselves. We assume that exceptional competence should naturally shield a person from imposter syndrome. But as psychologist Albert Ellis observed throughout his decades of cognitive research, highly intelligent individuals are actually the most prone to holding their own output to an agonizingly brutal standard, a standard they would never dream of cruelly applying to anyone else. They treat any slight gap between their actual performance and their theoretical potential as definitive evidence of a fundamental, unpardonable inadequacy. Once again, this loops back to the high end of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but in its most painful manifestation. The deeper and more sophisticated your understanding of a subject is, the more clearly you can map out just how much territory remains unexplored. The more you learn, the more accurately you can see everything you don't know. Genius does not produce absolute certainty. It produces a radically precise map of human ignorance. And when a person spends their entire life looking at that map, a deep, quiet sense of intellectual self-doubt becomes an almost inevitable byproduct of their clarity. When you step back and look at all of these psychological realities, a striking melancholy pattern begins to emerge. Almost every single one of them is systematically misread by modern society. The person who desperately needs quiet solitude to think is misread as cold and antisocial. The individual whose brilliant mind literally cannot stop firing is misread as merely anxious or neurotic. The person who feels the world with devastating emotional intensity is labeled as overly sensitive. The thinker who refuses to hold dogmatic opinions is seen as weak and uncertain, and the soul that cannot find intellectual resonance in a superficial world is cast aside as difficult or aloof. At its absolute core, having an exceptionally high IQ is not about being a human calculator, nor is it about collecting degrees or winning arguments. It is about experiencing the full, raw, unfiltered complexity of the universe, with very little buffer between you and it. The legendary psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whose pioneering work on exceptional minds transformed cognitive psychology, found that individuals with the highest intellectual capacities almost universally described their inner lives as the most complex, the most difficult to explain, and by far the hardest to share with the world. They are simply seeing the world at a level of resolution that ordinary life isn't always built to accommodate. If the traits we explored today resonated with you on a deeply personal level, if they gave precise language to an internal weight you have been carrying quietly, for as long as you can remember, I want you to know something. You are not broken, you are not a social failure, and you are not a strange anomaly. Your mind is simply operating exactly the way it was built to operate. This is the very first video on this channel, and we are dedicated to exploring the hidden psychological realities that shape our lives. If this video spoke to you, please leave a comment below letting me know which of these traits felt the most accurate to your personal journey. I promise to read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming deep dives into the human mind. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.